Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for our New South Wales AGM. I'd like to make a special welcome to our panellists this evening, to Dave Sharma for taking time out of your busy campaign schedule, Dave, and we always appreciate you've been a long-time friend of JNF and of Israel and going back some years, so thank you, Dave. And thank you to Ron. Ron doesn't need an introduction to any Zionist audience in Australia, but thank you, Ron, for supporting us on the panel tonight, and to Katerina Agiru, a first-time visitor to a JNF event representing the Ukrainian community, and thank you, Katerina, for joining us tonight. And the discussion will be moderated by New South Wales board member Zoe Smorgan, so thank you, Zoe, for doing that tonight, and welcome all. Last December marked 120 years since the Jewish National Fund was created by Theodor Herzl with a mission to build a future state of Israel, and hundreds of communities have since been established by JNF across Israel, and of course that mission of Herzl has been realised. But there was another mission, and that was the mission of David Ben-Gurion to develop the Negev, and with respect to that mission, a lot of work's been done, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's ongoing, and JNF Australia has taken it its personal mission to realise that vision together with other branches of JNF around the world. And the video that you just saw is an example of some of the recent work and some of the recent achievements in terms of realising that vision. And sometimes people say, well, why is it so important to develop the Negev? Why was it so important to Ben-Gurion? And there's three main reasons. The first, the obvious one, is security. Having thriving communities in that part of the country gives the country strategic depth, enables those communities to keep a watch over Israel's southern border. But it's not just about security, it's also about the ability to grow. You would have seen in the video that about 60% of Israel's landmass is the Negev, so it's a large, relatively to the rest of the country, is quite large, but only has a small percentage of the population, about 8%. Whereas in contrast, the centre of the country, there's a demographic bubble, and in order to alleviate that bubble and give the country space to grow, the Negev needs to develop. And so that work is ongoing, and it will help Israel grow in a sustainable way. And in terms of that word sustainability, that's really the third main reason why the Negev development is critical. Even Ben-Gurion realised that in order to develop communities in the desert, it would challenge every ounce of Jewish ingenuity and innovation. And in fact, as we've seen over the last decades and the last recent years, by forcing us and forcing Israel to develop communities in the Negev, we've had to create whole new industries and whole new approaches, whether it's to desert agriculture, water management, renewable energy, envirotech, etc. And so it not only helps those communities to thrive, but it creates jobs and new sources of income for Israel itself. So that's the three main reasons why it's critical for Israel that the mission in the Negev succeeds, and that's why we're focused there. Just one current example of what JNF Australia is involved with in terms of some of the sustainability and innovation type projects in the Negev. With the proceeds of a very generous bequest, New South Wales bequest, we're developing a centre for innovation and sustainability in Sderot. And that's going to be quite a significant centre. It will incubate startups in those areas of agri-tech and envirotech. It'll also create a lot of jobs in the region, and so stay tuned to learn more about that project. Yossi Eshed, our Shaliach, will give an update on some of our recent work, recent projects in the Negev later on after the panel during the AGM. So we look forward to that. In terms of this year's campaign project, and please save the date, September 6th, we're looking forward to return to an annual dinner after 2 years of virtual galas, and that will be in support of a project to build 14 protected kindergartens in the Shah HaNegev region. That's a region on the border with Gaza. Unfortunately, over the years and even in recent days, it's been the target of rocket attacks. And so those communities and those kindergartens need to be reinforced. And so together with the Ministry of Defence, we're not just building the kindergartens themselves, but also the outside areas where the kids spend most of their time when they're not under a red alert. So that'll be the main campaign project, and there'll be more information coming about that this year. Of course, all of this work wouldn't be possible without your ongoing partnership with JNF, and I not only want to thank you again for that, but invite you to see the fruits of that partnership later in the year when we have a mission. We're returning to mission, so October 23rd to November 1st, we will be holding mission focused on mainly the south, but going across all of Israel and looking at some of the various projects that JNF's been involved with. And finally, just a bit of good news. Last month, Ramat Herzl, which was last year's main campaign project, was officially approved by the Israel government as a yishuv, as an official community. And that's very important because it not only puts that community on the map, literally puts it on the map, but all the ongoing government support services, educational services, infrastructure, etc., will now flow. So it's an example of JNF Australia's role with a lot of communities in the area. We go in, we provide the initial seed money to get a project, a community going, and then others come in and follow after us and ensure that those communities are sustainable. So I'd just like to finish off before inviting Zoe and the panel to read from a message from Eran Doron, because Eran is the mayor of the region, and he called quite excitedly last month to announce this decision by the Israel government, and he had a short message that he wanted me to convey to our donors, so I'll just read it to you. He said that yesterday the Israel government approved the establishment of Ramat Herzl. We are grateful and honoured that together we are building the future of the State of Israel and enabling hundreds of young Israeli families to build their homes in the Negev and take part in the Zionist Act. In your decision to believe in us and the project, you have proven once again, as in Shazaf, that your vision and actions are a torch of leadership. So I'd like to thank all of you for helping light that torch and for your ongoing partnership with JNF in order to realise Ben Gurion's vision. And I'd now like to invite Zoe to come up. So Zoe, would you please give a warm welcome to Zoe Smorgon
Okay, welcome and thank you for spending your evening with us tonight. I will begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Now, this should be a very interesting and interactive evening. We are here to discuss the conflict in Ukraine and the ripples and waves that it's spread out across the world, as well as current events here in Australia and in Israel. My name is Zoe Smorgon and I'm a JNF New South Wales board member. And I will begin by introducing Katerina Agaru, who has very kindly joined us tonight. Katerina was born in the Ukraine. Oh, sorry, is that better? Yes. Katerina was born in the Ukraine. She spent her childhood in the Ukraine and then in Canada. She moved to Australia 10 years ago. Before that, she graduated with honours from Georgetown University and the London School of Economics. She's currently an investment analyst at Maple Brown Abbott and volunteers as the co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisation and a co-founder and New South Wales representative of the Australian Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce. Katerina has been very busy of late. Okay, so for the first part of this panel discussion, I'd like to ask you if you can give us a brief update of what the situation in the Ukraine is like at the moment.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Thank you for the invitation, and it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to speak to all of you here. Thank you for your interest, and more than happy to provide an update on what's happening in Ukraine. So I'm sure that there have been quite a few headlines across your screens and newspapers. Just background-wise, I'm obviously here in Australia. I moved here 10 years ago, but my entire family is back in Ukraine. So that includes my parents that are based across Kiev and Lviv. That includes my sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins. All my extended family is there. So not only do I see the news headlines, I also get daily updates from them and what they're feeling and what they're going through. What started as an offensive from the Russian forces across most of Ukraine, especially north, east, and south. It has now, Putin has officially announced that he has ceased the northern part of the attack because the special operation, according to him, has been successful. We obviously know through the Western media that the forces there had to retreat because of the defense that the Ukrainian forces were putting up, despite the fact that they were outnumbered and outgunned. So now the focus is very much on eastern Ukraine, around an area that's called the Donbass. There has been a conflict and a war going on there since 2014. So this is something that's not new to Ukraine, just the level and the sheer brutality of the force that is being used in eastern Ukraine, that is at completely new levels. So from what is happening in the east now, from what it looks like is that the Russian forces are trying to connect Russia to Crimea. They obviously annexed Crimea in 2014, and now one of the biggest goals is to form a land bridge from Russia to Crimea. Obviously, it is of significant strategic importance. They can reinforce their troops. The Black Sea Fleet is there. So from Russia's perspective, that's kind of the goal there is to connect that and to continue in the Donbass.
So on that note, given the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces and the resistance of the people, how do you foresee this ending, and what compromises do you see being made to facilitate that happening?
Two parts to that question. I'll answer the first one. How do I see it ending? That answer only one man has, and it will end when Putin wants it to end. Because Ukraine is not on the offensive, they are on the defensive. They are fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for the right to determine the future of the country and what direction they go into, whether it's the EU, NATO, it doesn't matter, whatever the future is and what is decided. So the level of attacks and what's happening in the East right now, it very much depends on when Putin decides that it should end. As we know, leaders like him have big aspirations. He has not been, it's not a big secret that Putin has bigger aspirations than Ukraine. He's given warnings to Finland, to Sweden. Moldova's also a target. And Ukraine, in my perspective, is just the first part on the map. And there is no limit to how far west he can go.
So thinking about, following that train of thought, when you look at what the rest of the world has done to support Ukraine, I mean specifically here we're talking about Australia and Israel, what do you see what further help can be offered, or where have we gone wrong in the past month, in a sense?
So the help has been phenomenal, both from a business, a government, just regular citizen perspective. I try to reach out to as many politicians and business people here in Australia. I'm myself am in the business community. If I were talking about Ukraine 3 months ago, business and politics is like oil and water. No one wants to get involved. Business people are very cautious in terms of how they get involved in politics and what they say. But now we've seen businesses come out with statements of support. They've been very clear. There's no, gray area. It's either black or white. So from that perspective, it's been great. The Australian government has reacted quite quickly as well. Something that you can historically say is bureaucratic, decisions take a long time to make. I've seen myself how quickly decisions have been made. And to that, I think that the government should be given lots of credit. What more could be done? This is something that Ukraine and President Zelensky is probably screaming from the rooftops. There is only one thing that can aid Ukraine right now, and that's weapons. And it's something that is very difficult to talk about. I myself am very non-confrontational. I struggled to even ask or say the word weapon a few weeks ago, but I see how difficult it is in Ukraine right now. I see the types of weapons that the Russian troops are using, and it's a case of where my cousins were asked to make Molotov cocktails to go up against Russian tanks. The force is just disproportionate. So the level of humanitarian aid has been phenomenal and has been reaching Ukraine quickly. But as I say, Band-Aids and blankets are not going to be needed when people are just slaughtered. So that's the only thing that can help Ukraine right now is more military support.
And on the humanitarian front, we've seen millions upon millions of people leave Ukraine when and how they could. I mean, what is the approach to bringing those people back and also to rebuilding cities and infrastructure and everything that's been lost at some point in the future?
Yep, so if I may put some numbers around it, I just have some latest statistics from UNHCR. So as of this Monday, we had 5.2 million refugees that fled from Ukraine. 90% of those are women and children, and that is because there's martial law in Ukraine right now. Men aged 16 to 60 can't leave. The borders are shut for them no matter how much they plead and ask. So that's 5.2 million refugees that are outside of the country. Internally displaced, so for people from the east, either coming to the central areas of Ukraine or to the west, that's 7.7 million. These are huge numbers of displaced people that also don't have homes. The western cities are completely overwhelmed with the influx of displaced people. Plus you have the countries that are on the border of Ukraine that are also overwhelmed with the influx of refugees, most of them crossing by foot. So that's the scale. In terms of when are they coming back and if they're planning to come back, as soon as we saw the Russian troops retreat from Kyiv and the northern areas around Kyiv, we've already seen people returning and coming back. Even though officially the government said this might be too early, the attack is still imminent and there's airstrike warnings every day that still go on with the sirens, but people have already started to return. So it's not a case of people wanting to migrate for greener pastures. They want to come back to Ukraine. They want to contribute to its rebuild. And right now, aside from asking for weapons, the other thing that Zelensky in all of his conversations is asking for is to think about the future, to think about rebuilding, because over $1 trillion of damage has been done to Ukraine already in terms of critical infrastructure, in terms of hospitals, in terms of the things that have already been bombed, residential buildings. So there's a lot of work that will need to be done, and it's up to countries like Australia, other Western countries, to see how they can help, whether it's with loans, whether it's sponsoring a city or a town and seeing how they can help with rebuilding schools, rebuilding different projects around there. So it could be done on a government level or a city-to-city level.
Thank you, thank you. I think it's a nice moment in time to actually bring in Ron and Dave, if you don't mind, because, thank you, Katerina. I would like to ask.
Stay.
You could please, yeah.
You stay. Continue. Yeah.
Here we go. I hope it's on. Thank you for joining us. Three weeks out, or 4 weeks out. Dave, can you comment on the implication of the Ukrainian conflict within Australia's security concerns and within our region? I mean, obviously it's had huge ripples and continues to create sort of massive waves of influence all over the world, but for our region.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And look, I'm here 3 weeks out from an election because it's such an important issue, to be honest, and it should be a topic of debate for this discussion. And I did just want to acknowledge Katerina and the work she does with the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations. They're an incredibly professional organisation that's staffed entirely by people with full-time jobs who are just passionate about their country. They've done a great job in communicating with us as members of Parliament, the government, the great job in getting the community engaged and aware, and a great job in, I think, marshalling and making it easy for us as politicians to support the cause there. Look, it matters, I think, very deeply. Of course, everyone's touched at a human level by what's going on in Ukraine, and people like Katerina and others have family members there, and that's certainly an element of our response. But at a bigger level, what Russia is doing is levelling an assault against the international order. It's levelling an assault against a sovereign country in an unprovoked way. It's levelling an assault against all the underpinnings of peace and stability since the end of the Second World War, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of countries, the inviolability of borders, the prohibition on the use of force as a means to settle disputes. And of course, that means that how this conflict ends is going to have a very enduring impact on how the world operates. If if it's seen to be, and thankfully it doesn't, it's not heading in this direction, but if it's seen to be that Russia is rewarded for this naked act of aggression with territory or diplomatic recognition, or even a peace which basically gives them some of what they want, then the lesson that other countries will take is that might is right, and that force trumps international law, and that you can get away with these things.
Can I ask you a question on that? Obviously, the landscape of energy politics is critical in this conflict at this point, and there was no coincidence that this happened in the middle of winter. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's also going to play out a large role in in this conflict going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's obviously, Europe has known for some time that it's quite dependent on Russian gas. It's become more dependent in the last few decades as Europe has sought to phase out coal-fired power and nuclear power. In the case of Germany, they've become more dependent on gas, because gas is the firming energy source for renewables, right? But Germany gets, I think, 30% of its gas from Russia. The rest of Europe's about a quarter, 25%. Suddenly all these countries are now rushing for baseload power again, nuclear power, coal-fired power and whatnot. And I think Russia's still very dominant in the global energy markets in oil and natural gas, so it's going to have a big disruption. And look, over time, it might accelerate our transition away from fossil fuel dependence, but in the short term, it's actually making us more fossil fuel dependent, I think.
Hopefully, at some point, we will head in that direction. Ron, I'm hoping at this point I can ask you for comments on the very, very, very fine line, if you can speak, that Israel has played, and the fine balance that it's had to play out in terms of its response to the conflict in Ukraine.
Thanks, Zoe. So firstly, there's absolutely no doubt that Israel stands, completely in support of what Dave was explaining in a very erudite way, that this is a battle between authoritarianism and democracy, that you can't violate sovereign borders, the world order is being upended. And I wouldn't say just Israel's treading a fine line. Germany's treading a fine line over its energy needs. The West is treading a fine line over not providing a no-fly zone because they have their own interests. And Israel has particular interests. But before we just discuss those interests, I think it's very important to say, actually, the tremendous role that Israel has played in this tragedy. At the humanitarian level, with the shelters, with the field hospital, which is, of course, everybody knows about, which is in the Ukraine, which is the buses that are carrying people from one end to the other without question whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. The fact that 20,000 Ukrainians were in Israel, non-Jewish Ukrainians working or on tourist visas who've all been allowed to stay. The fact that Israel has already taken in over 6,000 Ukrainian refugees, and I believe that's approximately the same number as Australia, from a country a third the size. And I think that's very important to say. And the fine line that Israel has to tread, one other aspect is the political aspect, where Israel strongly supported the United Nations General Assembly resolution condemning Russia, and in recent days has called for the ouster of Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council because of the atrocities perpetrated by the Russians, the war crimes. So I think that it's important to get into perspective. But the problem for Israel is that we have two problems in effect. One is that there's large Jewish populations in Russia which are at risk. And the second one is that Israel faces an existential threat on its northern borders with Syria. Putin is in control there. Putin is allowing Israel to take out Iranian assets throughout Syria. And almost to certainly ensure that we had a rocket coming over from Lebanon just now, but that there's virtually no repercussions for Israel. And it's a fine line for a very small country which does not have strategic depth. I heard Dan talk about strategic depth of the Negev. It's a joke, the strategic depth of Israel. Yeah. So, we don't have an eastern and a western part to flee from or flee to. So I think that it's very important to understand the considerations that the Israeli government has to go through, and it has large Ukrainian and Russian populations within it, which also need to respond.
There's a point in there that I want to come back to later, and that is in the press here, Israel had a lot of negative press for its sort of lack of response within Ukraine, and I'd like to come back to discussing that in a little bit. I just want to ask one more question on the topic. I know there's the elections coming up, and I think it's fair to say in Australia, this is a little bit left of field, there's an element of complacency when it comes to the freedom and democracy that we do enjoy. And do you think that what's happening in the Ukraine and the offensive that Russia's taking will shake that up to some degree? Anyone, open question.
I'll answer it briefly. In my view, yes, and so it should. I think, look, two things that stand out for me is international developments that should be affecting or in the minds of people who are voting, Russia's aggression against Ukraine and China's establishment of a military base in Solomon Islands, which could be a terrible portent of things to come. It should have everyone sitting up and paying attention, I think.
Very much so, yes. Thank you.
I have to say, coming from a different country and looking at the beauty and freedom that exists here and comparing it to what's going on in other parts of the world, I think Australia is incredibly fortunate to have rule of law, to have such a safe environment to do it in. Some people, when I tell them back home that, you have to vote here and it's mandatory, they think it's crazy because they can't see that ever happening where they're from. So the level of engagement here from an outsider's point of view is incredibly high, but I think that some people really take it for granted. So absolutely, there are people on the other side of the world that are literally dying for this right to be able to live in a country where they can vote and decide on their future. So to put it into that perspective, I think it's phenomenal what we have here. And I've been here for 10 years as a citizen now and participate in all these processes. I could not be more grateful.
Well, hopefully it opens some eyes. I think we will move on to something that we can't ignore at this point, which is the current situation that's been happening in Israel, and I know, Ron, you touched on it. Easter, Ramadan, Passover all coincided in Jerusalem and around the world this year, and there have been huge flare-ups, rocket attacks, stabbings, and riots on the Temple Mount. Ron, I'd love you to give us a little bit of insight into what's happening.
So I'd like to throw in one comment before that on one of the effects that we should learn, one of the lessons we should learn. I think it's fantastic that the democratic world stands with Ukraine and understands the struggles that Ukraine is going through. I wish that the democratic world will stand as strongly with the democratic state of Israel when her sovereign borders are violated against the forces of totalitarianism and terror. And I think it's a very important lesson for other countries around the world to understand, which, by the way, the Australian government understands very well, the current Australian government, in what way it needs to support Israel in international forums, because it's a fight between democracy and tyranny, and all the democracies need to stand together and consistently. In terms of what's happening now, I think you have to, firstly, it's not all the same thing, right? Israel is facing a number of issues. Number one, and let's not forget that it's Ramadan, as you already pointed out. Last Ramadan, the rockets came over from Gaza. Yeah. Every time peace looms and every time peace looks better, the forces who want to destroy that peace become much more active. And the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has shifted in a large way from being a Palestinian-Israeli conflict or about a two-state solution or about any of those things, not saying that they're not important, but really to the Temple Mount. And unfortunately for Israel, that's transformed it from a political conflict to a religious conflict. And it's much easier to inflame tensions around a religious conflict. So we started off with 14 Israelis being massacred by terrorist acts inside Israel. Some of them lone wolves, some of them mostly Palestinian Islamic Jihad, because there's a competition amongst Palestinian terror groups to see who can really take the front. And the only way you can do better is and it followed immediately the meeting in Sde Boker that Dan highlighted before of the Abraham Accord countries. The Abraham Accord countries scares the pants off Palestinian terror organisations because Israel and the Arab world is coming closer together with a lot of common interests, but a lot of understanding of Palestinian intransigence. So then Hamas, which was left out of the picture, sees an opportunity to once again inflame the Temple Mount. And although the press starts from midway through the crisis, I just, on my way here today, and I wanted to read out this one little thing, the United Nations Security Council has a monthly discussion on the Palestinian conflict. And Tor Wennesland, who is the United Nations Middle East representative, who is not, nobody would call him a Zionist, this is his report to the United Nations Security Council. On the 15th of April, during the early hours of the morning, a large number of Palestinians gathered at Al-Aqsa compound. Some Palestinians threw stones, fireworks and other heavy objects towards Israeli security forces. He went on to say, despite the tensions overall, hundreds of thousands of Muslims, Jews and Christians have been able to celebrate the holy days in and around the old city in relative peace and without further escalation. If only that appeared in the press. So what you have now is an escalation around the Temple Mount. Israel, I mean, talks of desecration. The terrorists who were perpetrating these were wearing shoes inside the mosque, chipping away at the mosque to have stones to throw. They came with fireworks. And, you know, these are not, it's not throwing confetti.
So, I mean, I'm going to bring it back to a local situation in that what we constantly see is, I think what was used as the tool in this situation was social media having a really, really, really powerful and inflammatory effect. And my question to all of you, and perhaps to start with Dave, is what can we do, locally especially, to reduce the effect of, I guess, social media in terms of anti-Semitism, which has been growing on both sides of the spectrum, and also, I mean, we saw the BDS movement really take hold with the Sydney Festival recently, and thank you for your comments, which were wonderful and very grounding, but I would like to hear a little bit more from you about what you think is possible that we could do to change that situation and take the power a little bit out of the social media.
Yeah, look, it's a challenge that I think we all face as societies right now, as to how to harness and control these beasts that we've allowed to be unleashed upon us. And I think, the answer, you know, I'm not someone who reaches for regulation or legislation by instinct, but just as we've put in place laws and frameworks to govern behaviour in physical spaces, in the civic discourse and in the press and in media, whether it's defamation or, you know, pieces of legislation like the Racial Discrimination Act or whatnot, we need to be doing the same things in social media. And we've started to take these sorts of steps in Australia with social media, whether it's sharing of graphic sexual content, for instance, or live streaming terrorist acts like we saw after Wellington, increasingly putting in place takedown or notice and takedown provisions in social media. But I think there's probably something more. Elon Musk, as many would know, has made a play for Twitter. One of the things he said today that he wants to see happen if he gets control of Twitter is basically greater policing to remove, you know, bot accounts, and these do exist in large numbers, and they're used by the Russians and others to sort of shape events, but also anonymised accounts. And there's a lot of humans that sit behind anonymised accounts. You'll see them with a picture, an image, and a strange handle that say the most disgraceful and disgusting and violent, anti-Semitic and racist and other things. I think we should be unmasked. I mean, you can't publish a letter in a newspaper without putting your name and your details attached, and you can't publish an opinion piece, so you can be held account for this. I think we should be doing the same on social media.
I think that's a fantastic perspective, to be honest. Seeing high school students with the most devastating information on their phones and content being thrown around like it's nothing from anonymous sources is really, really very, very destructive. Thank you. So,
did you want to add to it?
I'll have a word on that. Again, everything Dave said, but I think that there's two things about social media. Number one, it's a megaphone, it's an amplifier, it's all of that, but it's not as influential as we try to make out that it is. It is very influential, but it's not as... Well, when Bella Hadid reposts posts, nobody knows if it's accurate. No, and I think the biggest problem we have is that we're very superficial in our responses. We don't, I'm talking about our own community, doesn't know the facts, so they don't know how to respond. They don't understand that BDS is not a liberating movement of the West Bank. It's anti-Semitic. It's for the total destruction of the state of Israel. You know, we're trying to fight a battle about 1967 and with the aftermath of the Six-Day War. And BDS is fighting a battle about 1948, about Israel's actual establishment. So we have to understand the causes of it is. And also we can't escape the fact, and two different think tanks that I belong to in Israel are doing a lot of work on this, in the mega trends that are taking place, not just in the Jewish community, but right throughout the world. Hybridity, people are no longer in a community, but they're in multiple communities. Look at your own WhatsApp groups and see how they're different and how you're different in each community. And I think that we need to establish, not with the people who are perpetrating BDS, but with the people who are listening to them, influence makers, people who are working in the same categories. We can't fight social media with the methodologies we've been fighting it before. You know, there's a fantastic meme going around now. A Palestinian woman is sitting saying, I witnessed them stealing Big Ben. Right? No, it's just rubbish. But that's been reposted over 1 million times. Right? So one of the other things, though, about the megatrends amongst the general population is distrust. They're distrustful of the official organs, but they're just as distrustful of social media. And I think that the test of social media's success in the next few years will be whether it actually influences political action and political discourse. And we've got a few years to tackle that, and we have to begin immediately, before we see the negative results. But I would say on the upside, notwithstanding social media, and probably with no agreement in the room, that in a public relations sense, Israel never had the support that it's got today. With the Arab world, with the non-Arab world. Look what happened last year when the Hamas rockets came over and how almost every free country stood with Israel. Austria, for God's sake. The Austrian Chancellery was flying the Israeli flag. So it is possible to change things, and I think that we shouldn't be too despondent, but we should get out there and do it. But the first thing is know the facts.
Thank you.
I'd also like to join and say that I agree with Dave in terms of unmasking some of these people on social media, especially the bots, just because of the profound impact it has on society and changing public opinion and things like that. I guess the comment that I can add from my perspective in terms of the Ukraine and Russia war is that there's been a good and a bad, in the sense that good, we have had people on the front lines that have been able to post to social media and use that as an amplifier to actually show exactly what's happening. So these are the things that are being fired, these are the war crimes that are occurring, and that has been an incredibly powerful tool for locals to use. At the same time, we've also seen the way that Russia can harness social media and how it can use that to amplify propaganda. So there's, I guess, both sides of the coin there, and it's very difficult to use it in one sense but not the other, and who's going to marshal it and who's going to police it. But it just shows the power, I think, that it has.
Not Elon Musk. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And maybe I'll provide one other example. So in the Ukrainian community in Sydney, what we've been trying to do is to identify, and this has been a global movement started from Ukraine, is to identify businesses which still have not left Russia, that have not divested from Russia, that haven't closed up shop. Obviously, they operate in Russia, they pay taxes, they fund the war, is the logic. And it has been incredibly powerful to use social media to shame these companies and to see how within days they've changed their opinion to say that this is, a complete marketing disaster for them, and it actually got those companies to the table to speak with our activists. And another organization like the Red Cross, for example, was highly criticized for the meeting that the leader of the Red Cross, CEO or whatever his position was, had with Lavrov, the foreign minister. He was pictured smiling. Then there were people being taken across the border from Mariupol to a Russian city against their will. And so there was a massive pressure on Red Cross not to facilitate these movements of people across to the Russian border. And when we had a meeting with Red Cross, they said in 150 years of their existence, they have never felt so much pressure as what social media has put on them.
That is an outstanding example. I think we have to stop for a moment and take some questions from the audience, which a gentleman at the back has raised his hand very quickly.
Apropos the relationship between Israel and the Ukraine, in the last 75 motions against Israel in the United Nations, the Ukraine has voted against Israel 74 times and abstained the other time. Is the relationship, as a result of what Israel has done now, going to change that?
Sorry.
This is a tough question for me because obviously I don't have as much exposure and experience with that, but what I can say in terms of the Ukraine-Israel relationship, and I am not, I have to admit, I'm not across the detail of the voting and what the reason was and what it was for, but what I can say is that the leaders of our government, so I think this is the only other state outside of Israel, both the president and the prime minister of Jewish origins. They have incredible support within Ukraine. They both won in a landslide victory, 73%. They obviously have connections to Israel, and they support Israel from what I can see. I know that there's been a little bit of negative press and negativity because Zelensky himself is saying he wants Israel to do more. And I think we've heard on the panel here why Israel is saying that they can't, or the level of support that they have provided. So I think that they're in a tricky position, but from the relationship that I can see between the two countries, I think there's definitely room for improvement and to do more, and hopefully we can work in that direction.
Thank you. Did you want to? Yes.
Here we go. Thank you.
You know, for the whole of Jewish history and the whole of Jewish life, and it's triply true for the State of Israel, we're involved in a balance between strategy and tactics. When it comes to strategy, the really big question for us is the continuity of Jewish values vis-a-vis the value of Jewish continuity. And that is something that informs every action that the government of Israel does, and particularly also particular to the Jewish community action. But when it comes to tactics, you know, I remind you what Ben Gurion said during the Second World War. You know, the British were fighting the Nazis and at the same time restricting Jewish entry to Palestine. And Ben Gurion said, we'll fight the Nazis with the British as if there's no white paper, and we'll fight the white paper as if there were no Nazis. Now, when you're a small country, we're not 300 million people like the United States. When you're a small country which has to balance a whole range of interests, we have to thread and walk that tightrope, thread that needle, you can use any cute saying you want, between those two things. And so when it comes to Ukraine, we'll support Ukraine because it's the right thing to do. And at the same time, and I alluded to it earlier, that democracies need to stand together and democracies need to support each other against tyranny. We need to educate Ukraine as to why their voting pattern needs to change. In 2016, when Ukraine was part of the United Nations Security Council, and there was the pile-on against Israel on Obama's resolution, supposedly, that he eventually abstained from, the Ukrainian ambassador made a terrible mistake. He said that Israel's actions were like the Russian invasion of the Crimea. Well, that was factually incorrect. It was morally incorrect. It was ethically incorrect. But the way to change that is the way that we've gone about changing it. Is not to tar and hang them in the wherever. The idea is to bring closer relations. Now, Zelensky, I'm not certain that Zelensky today will say that Israel didn't help in the appropriate way. There's a lot of advantage to the Ukraine by Israel having good relations with both Russia and the Ukraine. At one time, the Prime Minister of Israel was seen as a go-between. I don't know, that was a bit dangerous for Israel in particular, but nevertheless, he took that particular line. And I think that as the countries work together, there'll be a greater degree of support. But I would point out to you that Ukraine wasn't alone in the United Nations Security Council, and, you know, America abstained, but Britain, Germany, they all also voted against Israel in those times. And as Natan Sharansky said, if we won't talk to anybody who votes against Israel at the United Nations, we'll have nobody to talk to. So I think that it's wonderful to have principles and it's wonderful to have ideals, but at the end of the day, if you want to survive in the real world, think about Ben-Gurion, think about how he survived led a country that survived against the odds, and think about how, by understanding each other better, we can bring that voting record, not just of the Ukraine, but many other countries, to a better resolution.
I'm sure some of you have seen recently an interview between Christian Amanpour and Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel. And as far as Israel is concerned, I certainly know where Christian Amanpour stands. But she raised a question about Israel and Israel's support for the Ukraine. And he was a diplomat. Dave, you would be able to relate to that. And part of his answer was, if the world expects us to be a conduit between Russia and Ukraine, we have to behave a certain way in which we are accepted as a conduit by both of those countries.
Well, as I said, by Israel maintaining relations both with Russia and the Ukraine, they can act as a conduit. Prime Minister Bennett also said Christian Amanpour was a liar. You left that part out. And you said he was being diplomatic. I don't think that was diplomatic at all. But clearly one thing that's changed in Israel, and I think it's a very positive change, is under Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was a fantastic advocate, but he was the only advocate and nobody else had a role. And under the current government, you've got Bennett, you've got Lapid, you've got Gantz, and they each have a coordinated role with each other, where Lapid, as the foreign minister and really the power behind the coalition in terms of numbers, is running the case for Ukraine. Bennett has never condemned Ukraine in any way, but he was softer on the Russian tone, and he was one who went to meet Putin. So it's a I was going to say a game, but it's not a game. It's a paradigm that works very well for Israel. There's no doubt, as I said, who Israel believes is the aggressor in this case and who Israel believes is in the right in this case, and how it expresses it with all of the things that we've been talking about. It has to tread lightly through that minefield. But I think she's doing an excellent job.
Okay, final question. Anyone would like to pose something to any one of the panelists? Oh, up the front here? Yigal.
Yes.
You've got a big voice.
I have a question to Mr. Sharma. I'm Israeli, and I always seen Australia as a big supporter of Israel. But in-house, in your parliament, in Canberra, is there a lot of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism through the politicians? Do you feel that? And if yes, what is your solution? How can we educate them better?
Look, I think the political class in the federal parliament, by and large reflects public opinion in Australia. And I have noticed in public opinion in Australia, as I'm sure you have, a growing threat of anti-Semitism in places that it didn't traditionally find a home. The progressive left, university campuses, environmental movements, and honestly, not being partisan here, parts of the Labor Party as well. And I think that's worrying, and that plays itself out in federal parliament. I mean, I think overwhelmingly in the federal parliament, mainstream figures on both the Liberal side and, by and large, the Labor side are supportive of Israel. But I do worry that that's changing, and we see it play out with things like the Sydney Festival boycott. So we talked about this before, right? This is the most obvious manifestation of the BDS movement in Australia for some time. Who came out and criticised that publicly? Well, look, I did. Paul Fletcher did. The Arts Minister, Federal Arts Minister Scott Morrison did. The New South Wales Arts Minister from a Liberal government did. The only figure on the left who did, from the Labor Party, to my recollection, was Walt Secord, who's the member of the Legislative Council in New South Wales. Tony Burke was asked to criticise it, refused to say anything. Anthony Albanese was asked to comment on it, refused to say anything. And it reflects a political reality for them, I think, because they think that if they were to come out and oppose a boycott and oppose the BDS movement, not to a Jewish audience, it's easy for them to do that, they do that all the time, right? But to come out and say to mainstream Australia, this is wrong, they're worried about alienating what they see as some of their base, which does have, progressive left elements to it. So I think it's happening slowly, but generally speaking, the bipartisan support for Israel in Australia is eroding somewhat. I don't think it's necessarily irreversible, but I think there's a challenge for all of us who support a strong Australia-Israel relationship. I'm taking off my hat now as a Liberal Member of Parliament. For all of us who support a strong Australia-Israel relationship, there's a work to be done there. And I think the best way, as Ron was touching on, is to help these people understand the complexities of the conflict a bit better, to get them to visit Israel and visit the Palestinian territories whilst they're there and speak to both sides. And invariably, every visitor I ever hosted when I was the ambassador in Israel would always come away realising that things were more complicated than they thought they were first going in, and a little uncertain about the opinions they might have been carrying with a high degree of uncertainty before, because it is a very complicated conflict. And I think unless you understand that, you can't really, I don't think, offer an informed opinion on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight, Ron, Dave and Katerina. That was wonderful. I'd like to introduce Pam. Thank you very much. Oh, we have...
Good evening, everyone. Zoe, don't run away. I would like to say thank you to you. And thank you, one and all, for a really enlightening and entertaining panel. In my capacity as JNF New South Wales President, I and the members of the New South Wales Board of Management warmly welcome you to this AGM. We thank you for your attendance here tonight and for your valued support of JNF Australia. I've had the privilege and pleasure of serving on this and the National Board of JNF for a number of years. It is hugely heartening to see this organisation's achievements continue to grow from strength to strength. Building on the great work done by the many that have come before us and establishing an enduring platform for the many to follow. Our mission is to educate the community about our work, fundraise for its wonderful life-changing projects, and continue to grow our future in Israel. The most tangible and meaningful measure of our efforts are the projects which we support through the funds we raise from you. Yossi Eshed, our Jerusalem emissary, will present a brief update, and you will get a real sense of the positive impact that these projects have on the areas and communities they benefit. Our project selection requires strict qualifying criteria, which ensures we deliver tangible, exciting, and life-enhancing outcomes, making a significant impact on both the environment and the communities they sustain. Projects completed to date are nothing short of impressive, and your donations have indeed been put to exceptionally good use. Our education Shaliach Igal Nissel will share with you some of the highlights and achievements of this past year and the significant role we play in Zionist education in Australia. In terms of our constitution, this AGM does not require elections, And I would like to acknowledge the JNF New South Wales board members for their valuable contribution to this organisation. Dan Katz, Owen Nathan, Zoe Smorgan, Mark Spiro, Gil Abras, Jason Eisner, and Jenna Meyerson. To New South Wales Executive Director Justine Williams and the entire dedicated New South Wales team. This past couple of years have certainly had its challenges, and during these unprecedented times, you continue to focus on what needed to be achieved. We thank you for your dedication and passion. Our thanks and appreciation to JNF National Management CEO Dan Springer and the National Management team. JNF Futures is a dynamic cohort of young, vibrant, committed Jewish leaders of the future, led by Kami Sharif. This group of young people aim to engage, energize, and empower young adults to strengthen the work of JNF Australia. Thank you all for your commitment to continue to grow our future in Israel. To Sheila Lazarus, she's not here, she's actually in Israel at the moment, who tirelessly runs JNF Forever, engaging the seniors in our community with monthly events, tours, lectures, and so much more. Thank you for all that you do. And to Paul Lowinger, I don't know where you are, Paul, I can see you somewhere. Mr. Blue Box, you have been an inspiration to so many for so many years. To you and all the volunteers, we thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to your continuing support, friendship, patronage for many years to come as we fulfill our mission of growing our future in Israel. I now call upon Dan Springer, our CEO, to deliver the Treasurer's report, as Gil Abras, our Treasurer, unfortunately has COVID.
Okay, so this will be a world record Treasurer's report. As we know, Gil texted today saying that he's got COVID. He's sent the slides this afternoon, which I believe will pop up. There we go. Firstly, just to notice the trend line. That's total donations, not including bequests. It's generally been going up. Since last year it dipped a little bit, but on an historical basis, I guess you would say that's flat compared to last year. And then when we look at bequests, we had a big rise year on year, and generally it's hard to budget, or it's impossible to budget for bequests, but I will say that Romy Dinty and Len Mamoff are doing a tremendous job with our plan giving work, and just want to acknowledge them and thank them. But when you add those two numbers, the bequest revenue and the donations, and then you net off that the expenses, which went down in New South Wales by 100,000 down to 900,000 last year, it led to an 8% growth in surplus, which is the total revenues less expenses. And that's following a previous increase the year before of 10%, and in fact over the last number of years has been quite solid increases in the surplus. So going back to Jack Welch, when he was CEO of General Electric, he was quite proud to present to his shareholders consistent income growth, and you can never guarantee anything for the future, but so far JNF is being managed financially very solidly and enabling us to do all the important work, the project work in the Negev, which is why we're here. So again, I want to thank you all for enabling that to be possible. In the interest of time, I promise this would be the world's fastest Treasurer's report, but The detailed financials are available in the room, so if anybody wants to grab a copy and have a look, you're welcome to do that. I'd also believe that was... Oh, I jumped ahead there. Okay. I'd like to acknowledge the bequesters who passed on over the last 18 months and who historically have made a significant contribution to the work of JNF and have enabled a lasting legacy in their memory. So, Zichronam Levracha, may their memories be blessed, and JNF continues to acknowledge those that have supported us through a bequest. I'd also like to acknowledge Les Rosenfeld, former National Treasurer, who's in the room today, who's worked tirelessly over many years with respect to managing the proceeds of those bequests, and often we've had to work through very tortuous legal processes in order for those bequests to see the light of day. And the Centre for Innovation that I mentioned earlier, that's one very large example, and that we'll be developing in the Shah HaNegev region of the Negev over the next few years. I'd like to just finish off this bit by making a couple of important acknowledgements. Firstly, to David Moses, who's standing in the back of the room, having a... David's standing there with Alan Slade, who's former National President and JNF royalty. So I'd like to separate you two for a moment, because I'd like to make a presentation to David. David's been a board member for the last 7 years, and for the last 3 years has been JNF New South Wales President, and he's applied his passion, his Zionism and his energy to the role, and overseen a lot of growth in JNF New South Wales, a lot of activity and a lot of collaboration with other organisations. So I'd like to thank David and to make a small presentation. Oh, sorry. Do you want the receipt as well? In case you're... Thank you, Dave. Another very important acknowledgement is Yigal Nissel. Yigal has been our education shliach since November of 2015. I checked that today, Yigal. It was November, I think. And in fact, I noticed when I was looking for the start dates some very funny emails between you and our CFO regarding all the paperwork in order to get into the country. So, but Yigal's been a fantastic education shliach. He's been tireless, he's been energetic, he's been creative. If he can't go this way, he'll go that way in true Israeli style and gets things done. And he's made a tremendous impact across various educational institutions, not just in Sydney, but in other states as well. He's been a welcomed visitor to Perth, a sometimes welcome visitor to Melbourne. I'm speaking out of school here, but he's had a very positive impact across the borders of Queensland as well. A much smaller community, but in fact, over Pesach, Yigal was there and made some visits to the schools there. But he's had a tremendous impact, and so popular that in fact Mariah approached us a couple of years ago and said, could we share Yigal? We said, yeah, at a cost, at a price, and it was really synergistic for us because we want Yigal in the schools anyway. So it's enabled a wonderful partnership with Mariah and with other schools. And another initiative that Yigal has been involved with is the resurgence of the teachers' tour that existed many years ago and then went quiet for a while, and then it re-emerged about 4 years ago, Yigal, 5 years ago, and it's been a tremendous success. It's taken hundreds of teachers to Israel, Jewish, non-Jewish, but all of them educating Jewish students. And so it's brought Zionism into a whole range of classrooms. It's enabled the teachers of Jewish schools, the non-Jewish teachers, to understand what that blue box in the corner of the room was all about. and enabled the teachers in non-Jewish schools to have a greater and broader sense of what Israel's about. And Yigal's been a key part of that, so I'd like to invite Yigal to come up to receive acknowledgement. And Yigal, I'll ask you to stay up because you can give your education report. So thank you, Yigal.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, everyone. Almost 7 years, a lot of time. Who remember November 2015? This is an AGM, so I need to speak about, the last year. And somebody asked me here in the audience just before the AGM, how do you define success? And it's hard to explain in words how do you define success. But I chose to maybe, see pictures. Maybe one picture is worth more than 1,000 words. But maybe I'll give you a bit of sense of numbers, because always people likes to hear numbers. And there's around 3,500 Jewish students in Jewish day schools in New South Wales. And in the last year, including COVID time, in Zooms, in schools, I've been educating 2,500 students, face-to-face, in the classes, outside the classes, and of course in Zoom classes. So this is just a bit of numbers, and if we wouldn't have COVID, I'm pretty much sure that I've seen, as every year, more than 3,000 students. So this is one of the, just to give you a bit of a sense of numbers. Beside that, we have also Jewish kids, students in non-Jewish schools, private schools, public schools, and I've seen more than 1,000 kids of them, from kindergarten all the way to year 12. What is my role? The main role is to educate about Israel, about Zionism, about JNF. JNF, as I believe, is the only fundraiser organization in the community nationally that is fundraising for Israel, and at the same time has a 100% role back to the community, and that's my role. And it's been that for years, and it's going to be for many more years. And it's been absolutely pleasure and privilege to be a part of the family of JNF, be a shaliach. And one of the highlights that we have that we've done in this year, and people are saying COVID have been horrible, and etc. So COVID as itself has been horrible, but for my work, it's been absolutely amazing, because resources that using me from teachers and educators asking me, can you please, because teachers, this was very hard if you have children and grandchildren, went to schools, big challenge. So I've been there for them. And educating them. And one of the things that you see here now in the pictures is letters, more than 1,500 letters from kids sending to Israel, to community in Sha'ar HaNegev, where they got all the missiles from Gaza. So bringing them together and get them a connection. One of the highlights that we have done is My Israel Passport, is 4,000 copies of sticker books that they collected, kids, collecting stickers about Israel, about Zionism, and that, imagine, in every home. Doesn't matter if you are studying we have kids who send us the sticker book 6 hours from Sydney. They got it from BGE, from different places, so we really reach out to so many Jewish homes around New South Wales. And like Dan mentioned about the teacher tour, how good is it that I finish with the final teacher tour in my time, the fourth one, with more than 70 teachers from New South Wales only. As I believe till July will be 80, but for now it's 70. New South Wales teachers were joining more than 200 teachers, Jewish and non-Jewish, in the past 3 tours that we have done in the last 5 years. So, in a way, I can just say that, we go to the schools, we go to teach them only for one reason, because for JNF, the future is so important. And without educating the future, our future, we can't have a future. So, again, thank you so much. And as I just want to finish, as every shaliach should say, לשנה הבאה בירושלים הבנויה. Thank you.
Yigal, תודה רבה, also as a friend. Because Yigal is so active and doing so many things, the joke in the office is his role is to spend money, and my role is to get money, and we're both doing quite well. So this is my best 5 minutes in the year when I have the privilege to give a project report. And I'm so excited and happy to do it, not only because I'm so proud of what we're doing, also I see it as my opportunity to say to you guys, to our supporters, toda rabah, on behalf of hundreds of thousands of people in Israel that enjoy what we are all doing together. Just before the project update, I want to ask you not to believe what I'm going to say, because they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, so a visit in Israel worth 1,000 AGMs. So I strongly encourage you to go and visit, whether it's a one-day tour, whether it's a 4-day hike, whether it's a 9-day proper mission in Israel. Pick up the phone, call the office, we'll organize a visit for you, and then you're gonna check if what I've just told you was right or not. So, Tachlis, I decided to focus on our recent 5 projects. As you can see, all 5 of them are focused in the same area of the Negev, just because the Negev is the future of Israel, from all the good reasons that Dan has mentioned. So we are very focused territorially, geographically, but we are dealing with various areas of life, all for the benefit of the people that live there. So the first project that was mentioned already is Ramat Herzl, and this was last year's project, and it's about to be completed, and the family is going to move into the houses in 4 months' time. And we're talking about first 14 houses, which may sound not much to some of you, but establishing a new community in Israel, it's a very rare moment in the history of the state. It doesn't happen every year. And to be the first ones that help them to do the kickoff and to start, it's amazing. And I strongly encourage you to go and visit Ramat Herzl, and more importantly, to meet with the people there, which are true pioneers that we all owe them so much, and to be part of it, that's amazing. A second project I want to mention is Kadesh Barnea, and the building has been completed already. We're talking about an environmental and educational center in the community of Kadesh Barnea, which is in the Nissan area, quite close to Ramat Herzl. We're talking actually about an area with 5 different communities, and they're all going to enjoy this center. The third one is the Nissan Ecological Park. It's still in progress. There was some delays because of COVID there, and also because of the winter. And it's going to be an amazing green area with birds watching and picnic areas, and just a good, nice green area for the families there to relax, to enjoy, because this is part of quality of life that they all deserve. A fourth project I want to mention that will be completed in 4 months' time. It took a little longer because because it was a bit complicated to build the building, because we're talking about a center for people with special needs, both physical and mental. And because of the special equipment they needed, etc., it took a little bit longer. And this is in the area of Sdot Negev, which is also quite close to Gaza Strip, about 15 kilometers. And again, this will be completed in a few months' time. And I went there last year, and I visited some of the families of the children with special needs that are going to enjoy the area and enjoy the facilities. Again, would be very moving for each one of you to go and visit. And the last project I want to mention is the Authorized Resilience Center, which will be completed next month. We're talking about the Resilience Center that will help children in Sderot and in the area of the Gaza Strip, children that suffer from post-trauma because of the missiles and the terror attacks. And this area has animal-assisted clinics. So actually they pair the children with pets, with animals, and then when the child sits at home and there's a siren, he doesn't think about his fears. He's thinking about the turtle or the goat that it's his, and the minute the guy, the boy, the girl can leave home and go to the place and go and visits and take care of the animal, and just amazing, and again, very, very moving to go and visit there. So, as they say, the best feeling of excitement is when you're excited because you've made someone else excited. And actually what we, the mishpucha of JNF, what we're doing together is helping those people and make them excited, not only because we send funds and build those things. It's more about the emotional connection and the fact that they know that we are here and we're thinking of them and we're working hard and we give as much as we can to help them. So we all should be very proud of what we're all doing. And I just want to thank you again for what we're doing and for what we will do in the future. Toda rabba. And now I want to, please I want to call Penny Halley for the presentation of the Sylvia Smoller Winnicott Award. Toda rabba.
Good evening. My mother, Sylvia Smoller, was a leader of the community. She was a Zionist who had a great love of Israel. Sylvia championed her philanthropy. In South Africa, she was the president of WITA for many years and was one of the founders of the Herzliya School in Cape Town, where she sponsored Jewish education for all the community. When she made Aliyah, she was on the board of governors of the Tel Aviv University and involved with JNF in Israel. My family appreciate the honor you have bestowed upon our mother with this annual award. My mother would have been very proud to link JNF with this year's outstanding recipient, Speedy Shatari. Speedy has been an active member of JN Future Committee since its inception. Speedy spearheaded the Gen Chai campaign, which aimed to make giving charity more accessible to young adults, encouraging them to commit to a donation of $18 a month for 6 months. The campaign raised funds for Royim Rachok, an organization which trains young adults on the autism spectrum to participate in the IDF, teaching life skills required to find a job after their military service. Speedy is also the Social Engagement Officer at the New South Wales Board of Deputies. It's my pleasure to call Speedy. Hi.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for what you do.
Good evening, and I thank the JNF once again. I've been doing this job for a number of years now, and it's a great privilege and honour to be here. And I want to express my gratitude on behalf of my family to the JNF for continuing to honour my father's memory with this award, which continues a long association of the Einfeld family with the JNF. During my father's life, he was a stout supporter of the JNF. In fact, nothing was actually more important to him in his Zionist work, which there was a lot, than his support of the JNF. My mother worked in the office of the JNF as an administrator for a number of years, and the JNF has honoured them with a forest in their name in Israel. Many of the shlichim who've been here are my personal friends. I'm in touch with many of them, and when I visit Israel, they take me around to see, as we were just invited to do, these wonderful projects which have done phenomenal things to build the state of Israel. One of the great things about the JNF is that you don't get involved in politics when you're involved with the JNF, unlike if you're involved with other Israeli organisations. They're always recruiting you for something or other, but the JNF recruits you only to support them and the projects and the people who benefit from the projects, which is a phenomenal experience to have as you go around these various projects and see the work that's been done and the achievements that have been made. And I again express my gratitude to the JNF for continuing to honour my father and mother with this award, which I am happy to present today to the Australian Jewish Fertility Network. Let me make it perfectly clear. Let me make it perfectly clear that my fertile days are in another time. So I personally haven't benefited from the work of this organisation, but I'm informed that it has done phenomenal work and is doing wonderful work. And this award is given, the Sidney Einfeld Memorial Award for Services to Israel and the Community is presented to the Australian Jewish Fertility Network in recognition of its outstanding dedication to the Sydney Jewish community. The network believes that no Australian Jewish couple should ever feel alone on their fertility journey. They deserve to have the support they need to help build the next generation. And that's what this network does. And I, on your behalf and on everybody's behalf, congratulate you on winning this award. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm so glad to see you here at this beautiful AGM. I'd like to say I'm standing here as a representative of 200 plus very, very dedicated volunteer workers, and I'm just so very proud to be representing them. If I may start off by just saying a few words of thanks. First of all, to the most important person in my life, apart from my wife, and that's Salome Woods. Salome is the engine room, the driver of the whole Blue Box campaign, Blue Box department of the JNF, and we all owe her a wonderful, wonderful vote of thanks. I would also like to thank all the office members at the JNF who have become very, very dear personal friends, and for all their kindness and all their all the things that they've given to us. The honour I've got tonight is very, very important to me. Every year we have 2 Blue Box campaigns. The Blue Box is, of course, the most easily recognisable symbol of the JNF. The aim is to have a Blue Box in every home and to visit that home, if possible, twice a year, to educate people and to let them know what we're doing. And we are very, very grateful for all and every one of our contributors. We have among our workers some very, very dedicated, hard-working people who do their work selfishly without asking anything, but just to be given a little bit of kindness. And the person that I'm going to present the award, the New South Wales 2022 Blue Box Worker of the Year Award, is one of those very, very special persons. It's Olga Retty. Olga could come forward. Olga is one of the shyest, kindest, sweetest people you could possibly meet. Olga goes around the Dover Heights area and clears no less than 6 Blue Box books. You know, she will help out anybody, and she always makes sure that every effort is made to visit every possible home, to contact every possible person, and to get their donation, and to let them know that that JNF is out there and as relevant today as it always has been. I asked Salome a few a little bit about Olga. And one little thing she said to me, which was quite ironic, usually parents go out and collect the blue boxes, and when they get a bit on in years and they don't do it anymore, they get their children to take over. In this case, the opposite happened, apparently. And Olga's son was co-opted by our Salome to clear blue boxes, and he co-opted his mother, and she got into it. So, and Olga has not looked back since then, and we just wanted to say thank you very, very much for all your very, very many efforts and your dedication and everything. Thank you. And it gives me great pleasure to present you with this award. Now, the Blue Box Work of the Year is nominated by each and every state branch, and their name is inscribed in the project in Misgav in Israel. And one of the 6 is then nominated or chosen to be the Blue Box Work of the Year for Australia. And your name is going to go in that list of 6, and we all hope that you're the one that gets it. So thank you very, very much, Olga.